At 35,000 feet above the American Midwest in a pressurized tube hurtling through thin air at 573 miles per hour, a woman whose quarterly earnings could fund a small nation's healthcare budget for 6 months stopped breathing. Her lips turned the shade of winter violets. Her fingers clawed at her throat with the desperation of someone who understood, perhaps for the first time in her carefully constructed 42 years, that money purchased everything except the next breath. 53 passengers watched her die. Some gasped. Some froze their phones, clutched like talismans against mortality. One man in business class Navy suit Rolex, catching the overhead lights, raised his iPhone and started filming his thumb, already composing the caption that would harvest sympathy and outrage in equal measure across his social media kingdom. But in seat 37B, crammed between a broken lavatory door that wouldn't latch and a screaming infant whose mother had given up on comfort 3 states ago, a black man in shoes held together with duct tape on the inside, where dignity demanded concealment, stood up. His hands were cracked from industrial cleaning solution and midnight shifts scrubbing executive floors where men in $1,000 shoes discussed his invisible labor. His 8-year-old daughter clutched a half-eaten granola bar, their only food since yesterday morning's gas station breakfast. His mother was dying in a Phoenix hospital 2,000 miles west, and he had exactly 11 minutes left to say goodbye if the plane landed on schedule, and the gate agent didn't make him wait while first class deplaned with their carry-on luggage and their assumption of priority. He saved the billionaire's life in 2 minutes and 53 seconds. Then he vanished into the Phoenix airport crowd before anyone could ask his name, because some goodbyes cannot wait for gratitude or recognition or the performative appreciation of strangers who would forget his face before their luggage reached the carousel. 8 months earlier, on a Tuesday that tasted like failure and smelled like industrial bleach, Darius Cole had woken at 4:17 in the morning in a one-bedroom apartment in Humboldt Park, where the radiator clanged like a prisoner, signaling for escape, and the neighbors above conducted their marital warfare in theatrical Spanish that needed no translation. Amara slept in the bedroom, her gap-toothed mouth slightly open, one arm wrapped around a stuffed bear missing its left eye. He'd found that bear in a donation bin behind the Presbyterian Church on Division Street, washed it 3 times in the bathtub with dish soap, and presented it to her as a birthday gift wrapped in Sunday comics. She'd named it Mr. B. Patches and loved it with the fierce loyalty that 8-year-olds reserve for objects that cost nothing and mean everything. The oatmeal container held exactly 3 servings. Darius measured carefully, adding water heated in the microwave because the stove's gas had been shut off for 47 days. The eviction notice taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet, where Amara wouldn't see it during her morning routine of catastrophically mismatched outfit selection and lengthy negotiations about hair elastics, gave them 6 more days in this apartment before the sheriff arrived with the paperwork that would make them officially homeless. $247.18. That was the sum total of Darius Cole's liquid assets on a planet where billionaires launched penis-shaped rockets into space for entertainment. $12.85 per hour at Willis Tower Night Custodian 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. $16.50 per hour at the Amazon Fulfillment Center in Joliet, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. when they scheduled him, which averaged 3 days weekly, because classifying him as seasonal for 16 consecutive months meant no health insurance, no paid sick leave, no obligation beyond the immediate transaction of labor for currency. Weekends, he fixed broken toilets and painted apartments for cash, $40 here, $80 there, the informal economy of men who'd learned that official employment came with official scrutiny, and official scrutiny revealed official debts that official bankruptcy hadn't officially erased. Amara appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing pink leggings and an orange shirt depicting a cartoon dinosaur wearing sunglasses. The colors screamed at each other like rival gangs claiming territory. Darius set the oatmeal bowl on their kitchen table, a card table he'd salvaged from a curb on Kedzie Avenue, and stabilized with folded cardboard under one leg. She climbed into the chair, feet swinging 6 inches above the floor. "Daddy, why is breakfast always oatmeal?" "Because oatmeal cost 89 cents for a container that lasted a week. Because eggs were $2.29 and milk was $3.49 and cereal was $4.69 for boxes that disappeared in 3 days. Because the WIC office had a 6-week waiting list and required documentation he couldn't provide without revealing the eviction notice and triggering a child welfare investigation that would take Amara away faster than unpaid rent. Because feeding your child was an optimization problem when poverty turned every meal into an equation balancing nutrition against survival. He said, "Because it gives us energy for big hearts, Amara girl." She considered this while chewing her expression grave with 8-year-old philosophy. Like mommy's heart, the photograph lived on the kitchen windowsill, held upright by two mismatched salt shakers. Serena Cole on their wedding day laughing at something outside the frame, her joy captured in pixels, that survived when breath and heartbeat didn't. December 14th, 2016. The insurance company had required 51 minutes to authorize the emergency surgery that should have begun in 12. Placental abruption, massive hemorrhage, her blood pressure dropping like a stone, thrown from a bridge while Darius stood in the delivery room in his Northwestern Memorial Hospital scrubs. Because he was a nurse, he understood exactly what was happening and watched algorithms decide his wife's life was worth less than the risk of an unnecessary procedure showing up in quarterly cost analyses. By the time authorization came through, Serena's hand had gone limp in his, her last words still hanging in the air like smoke. "Take care of our Amaradari, promise me." He'd kept that promise for 8 years, though. Some days keeping it felt like drowning in slow motion, his lungs filling with water, one breath at a time, while the surface receded and the light dimmed, and the weight of it rent food utilities. Dignity, hope pulled him under. Darius touched the photograph frame, one finger on the cheap plastic edge. Just like mommy's. Amara returned to her oatmeal, satisfied with explanations that asked no follow-up questions. Children were good at that. They accepted the world as presented until adolescence taught them suspicion. The Spirit Airlines ticket in his jacket pocket had consumed 3 months of lunch money, protein bars in the Amazon warehouse break room, and nothing else, his stomach growling through afternoon shifts while he loaded boxes containing items people ordered on impulse and returned without opening. $147 for a seat so narrow, his shoulders touched both armrests for a flight that served nothing but overpriced snacks for the privilege of arriving in Phoenix with 11 minutes to spare before his mother's last breath leaked away in a hospice room that smelled like industrial cleaner and death. Dorothy Cole had raised Darius alone after his father left with a 23-year-old secretary named Jennifer, who wore too much perfume and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. She'd worked double shifts at Denny's for 19 years, so Darius could graduate from nursing school without drowning in debt, her feet swollen from standing on industrial tile, her back curved from carrying trays loaded with breakfast specials and lunch combos and dinner plates heavy with American comfort food. When Serena died, when the medical bills reached $863,000, Dorothy had sold her car, moved into a trailer park outside Phoenix to reduce her expenses, and sent Darius $1,000 every few months with notes that said, "For Amara's birthday," or "For winter coats," or just "Love Mom," with no explanation needed. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4 by the time the symptoms became impossible to ignore, by the time the jaundice yellowed her skin and the pain bent her double, and the weight loss revealed bones she'd spent 70 years covering with flesh and muscle, and the accumulated substance of a life lived in service to others. The hospice nurse had called Tuesday morning while Darius was loading trucks. At Amazon had left a voicemail that began with, "Mr. Cole, this is Riverside Hospice calling about your mother Dorothy," and ended with, "If you want to see her, you should come soon." Soon. The word haunted him. Soon meant hours, maybe a day. Soon meant spending money he didn't have on a ticket he couldn't afford for a goodbye that would last 11 minutes if he was lucky, if the flight stayed on schedule, if the Phoenix traffic cooperated, if the universe granted him this one small mercy in a life that had taught him mercy was rationed by algorithm and distributed according to bank balance. Imara finished her oatmeal and carried the bowl to the sink, stretching on tiptoes to set it on the counter. She turned backpack already on her shoulders. The frozen backpack he'd bought at Goodwill for $3, its zippers held closed with safety pins because the original pulls had broken months ago. She looked up at him with Serena's eyes, the same warm brown that held light like amber. "Are we going on an airplane today, Daddy?" They'd discussed this. He'd explained in terms an 8-year-old could process without trauma. Grandma Dorothy was very sick. They were going to Phoenix to say goodbye. Airplanes were perfectly safe, even though they were loud and sometimes bumpy. He'd explained it twice, 3 times, answering her questions about whether Grandma would get better and whether heaven was real and whether Mr. Patches could come on the airplane. Darius knelt, bringing his face level with hers. The morning light through their kitchen window filtered through buildings and smog, and the accumulated grime of Chicago's industrial corridor caught the gap in her front teeth where the adult tooth was growing and crooked because dental insurance was a luxury item in the Cole family budget. He said, "Yes, Amara girl, we're going on an airplane." She nodded, solemn. Then she wrapped her arms around his neck and squeezed her small body warm against his chest, her breath tickling his ear. "I love you, Daddy." The words broke something in him, some internal dam he'd built to contain 8 years of grief and rage and exhaustion. But dams broke in private, never in front of children who needed to believe their fathers were strong. He held her tight, breathing in the smell of her hair, children's shampoo, 99 cents at the dollar store artificial strawberry scent, and forced his voice steady. I love you too, baby. More than the sky. Mrs. Beatrice Washington, who lived in the apartment next door and collected Social Security and cat figurines in equal measure, agreed to watch Amara during the flight and the hospital visit. 62 years old Black, she'd buried 2 husbands and a son and understood without explanation why Darius couldn't bring an 8-year-old to watch her grandmother die. She met them at O'Hare's departure terminal, her polyester jacket smelling like coffee and the peppermints she kept in her purse for Amara. She took Amara's hand, her grip firm and capable. We'll go get lunch at that Mexican place you like, the one with the quesadilla as big as your head. Then we'll see the airplanes take off, count how many are white and how many are blue. Amara looked up at Darius, her expression caught between excitement and uncertainty. He bent down, kissed her forehead. His voice dropped to a whisper. Be good for Mrs. Washington. I'll see you tonight. She nodded. Then Mrs. Washington and Mr. Patches disappeared into the terminal crowd, a small girl in mismatched colors holding the hand of an old woman who understood that sometimes love meant showing up when showing up cost nothing but time. Darius checked in at the Spirit Airlines counter, his boarding pass printing on thermal paper that curled at the edges. Gate B-17, seat 37B, departure in 43 minutes. The ticket agent glanced at his ID, at his worn jacket that had cost $8 at the Salvation Army store on Ashland Avenue. Her expression shifted through micro-calculations of class and race and worth settling on professional neutrality that conveyed everything words didn't. She handed back his license without comment. Gate B-17. Boarding begins in 20 minutes. The gate area smelled like recycled air and anxiety. Darius found a seat near the window away from the main cluster of passengers and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, had been cracked for 6 months since Amara dropped it, reaching for a book on a high shelf but functional. He opened his messages. Nothing from the hospice. No please hurry, or she's asking for you, or I'm sorry, but just silence, which meant Dorothy was still breathing, still waiting, still holding on with the stubbornness that had carried her through 7 decades of disappointment and perseverance. They called his boarding group Group 4, the peasant class, the passengers whose tickets cost less than the luggage fees first class paid without thinking. Darius joined the line, shuffling forward through the jet bridge, the corridor narrowing until it opened into the aircraft cabin. First class was a different country, leather seats that reclined fully horizontal, flight attendants offering champagne and warm nuts, passengers in business casual scrolling through tablets, their carry-on luggage stuffed into overhead bins with room to spare. One woman sat in 2A auburn hair, pulled into a severe bun navy suit that probably cost more than Darius earned in a month, Hermes scarf at her throat like a flag claiming territory. She was working on a laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the efficiency of someone whose time was measured in dollars per minute. Darius continued down the aisle into economy, where the seats pressed together like sardines in a tin, and the overhead bins were already full, and passengers fought over armrest space with the desperation of people who understood they'd paid for the privilege of discomfort. Seat 37B was exactly where the diagram promised, window seat, last row next to the lavatory door that wouldn't latch properly and banged open every time someone walked past. The flight attendant's voice crackled through the PA system. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Spirit Airlines Flight 2847 with service to Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. We'll be departing shortly. Darius fastened his seatbelt and closed his eyes. The engines spooled up, their vibration traveling through the fuselage and into his bones. The plane taxied, turned, accelerated down the runway with the gathering momentum of 37,000 pounds of metal and plastic and human cargo defying gravity through pure force. The wheels left the ground. Chicago fell away below them, the city where Darius had been born and raised and broken and rebuilt into something functional, if not whole. 35 minutes into the flight, Darius was reviewing his mental checklist: hospital address, Uber budget, estimated time from airport to hospice, if traffic cooperated, when the woman in first class stood up. He noticed peripherally the way you notice movement in your field of vision without focusing. She reached for something in the overhead bin, her body language casual routine. Then she stopped. Her hand went to her throat. Her face changed color, draining like water circling a drain. Darius watched her lips swell, watched her fingers claw at her neck, watched her stumble into the aisle and drop to her knees with the graceless collapse of someone whose nervous system was shutting down one neuron at a time. Anaphylactic shock. He recognized it instantly. The presentation was textbook, the progression, rapid the outcome, certain if intervention didn't happen in minutes. 53 passengers watched her die. The man in business class raised his phone. Others gasped their hands, covering their mouths in useless gestures of horror. The flight attendants rushed forward, their training kicking in, but their movements had the frantic quality of people following a script without understanding the medical reality unfolding in real time. Darius unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. 8 years since he'd practiced emergency medicine. 8 years since he'd walked away from Northwestern Memorial Hospital because every code blue made him hear the monitors that had screamed while Serena died. Every trauma case made him see her face. Every patient loss reopened wounds that had never properly healed. But muscle memory didn't forget. The hands remembered even when the heart tried to. He moved down the aisle, passengers parting instinctively. He knelt beside the woman, his fingers finding her carotid pulse, weak, thready, racing toward nothing. Her airway was compromised, her lips cyanotic, her eyes rolling back to show whites. His voice came out calm, the nurse voice he'd thought he'd lost. "Ma'am, I'm a nurse. Stay with me. You're going to be okay." The flight attendant appeared at his shoulder, her face pale. "Sir, you need to return to your seat." Darius didn't look up. "Anaphylactic shock. I need the emergency medical kit now. Does anyone have an EpiPen? Check purses, bags now." Someone shouted from row 12. "I have 1B allergy." A 17-year-old girl pushed through the crowd, her hands shaking as she held out the auto-injector. Darius took it, checked the dosage point. 3 milligrams, standard adult dose, positioned it against the woman's lateral thigh, and deployed it through her suit pants without hesitation. The needle punched through fabric and into muscle. He held it for 10 seconds, counting in his head, then withdrew. Her eyes fluttered. Color returned to her lips in slow stages, gray to pink to something approaching normal. Her chest heaved, pulling in air, with the desperation of someone who'd been drowning and finally surfaced. The flight attendant touched his shoulder. "Sir, you saved her life. We need your name for our report. The airline will want to." Darius checked his watch. The numbers glowed green in the cabin light, 10:47 a.m. Central Time. Phoenix was 11:47 Mountain Time. The hospice nurse had called at 8:30, had said, "Soon." If the plane landed on schedule, if the taxi queue moved quickly, if he didn't encounter delays, he had approximately 11 minutes between landing and too late. He stood his knees, protesting the cramped position. "Monitor her closely. Second dose in 15 to 20 minutes if symptoms return. Have paramedics waiting at the gate." The flight attendant stepped closer. "Sir, please, your name." But Darius was already moving back towards seat 37B, already calculating travel time and probability, already accepting that some goodbyes matter more than gratitude or recognition or the performative appreciation of strangers who would forget his face before their luggage reached the carousel. The woman struggled to lift her head, her eyes finding him through the crowd of passengers and flight attendants in chaos. She saw a black man in a faded jacket, an invisible person who'd momentarily become visible through competence. She tried to speak, her voice raw, but he was already gone, dissolving back into economy class like smoke dissipating in wind. The plane landed at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport at 12:03 p.m. Mountain Time. The woman, auburn hair, navy suit, Hermes scarf, $3.2 billion in net worth. Though Darius didn't know that yet, was removed first by paramedics with a stretcher and oxygen and paperwork that would later ask for identifying information about the man who'd saved her life. The flight attendant tried to find him. Checked seat 37B. Found it empty. Checked the manifest. Found a name, Darius Cole, and no other information except a Chicago address and a phone number that would go straight to voicemail for the next 48 hours. Darius ran through the terminal, airport security eyeing him with the suspicion reserved for running black men in public spaces. He made it outside to the taxi queue at 12:14 p.m. Riverside Hospice was 9.3 miles away. Google Maps estimated 17 minutes in current traffic. The taxi driver was Mexican, his dashboard decorated with photographs of children and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. Darius gave him the address and said, "I'll give you $50 if you get me there in 10 minutes. The driver glanced in the mirror, his eyes meeting Darius's, some calculation of risk versus reward and desperation playing out in the silence between them. Then he nodded and stepped on the gas. They made it in 11 minutes. Darius threw 320s at the driver, more than he'd promised, all the cash in his wallet, and sprinted through the hospice entrance. The building smelled like the intersection of medicine and death, industrial cleaner, fighting a losing battle against decay. A nurse at the desk looked up, her expression shifting to professional sympathy. She didn't have to say anything. Darius saw it in her face, in the way her shoulders dropped, in the way she started to stand before he'd even asked the question. Dorothy Cole's room was on the second floor, room 214, the door half open and the blinds drawn against the Phoenix afternoon sun that turned everything in Arizona into baked earth and desperation. Darius pushed through his breath, still coming hard from the run through the parking lot, and found his mother exactly where the architecture of death had placed her, in a hospital bed cranked to semi-reclined ivory pole, beside her like a mechanical guardian, morphine drip, clicking its measured mercy into her bloodstream, one drop at a time. Sweet Diamond. She was awake, barely. Her eyes open when he entered, the lids heavy with exhaustion and medication and the accumulated weight of 70 years spent in service to other people's needs. Her hand lifted off the blanket, the movement requiring visible effort, her fingers trembling like leaves in wind. Darius was at her bedside in 3 steps. He took her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently around her papery skin and prominent bones. She was so light. When had she become so light? Her lips moved. Her voice came out barely louder than breath, each word requiring intention. You made it. The relief in those 3 syllables broke him. He sat in the chair someone had positioned beside her bed, his throat closing around words that wanted to be apology and gratitude and grief simultaneously. He managed, I'm here, Mom, I'm here. She smiled. It cost her something, that smile, some reserve of energy she'd been hoarding for exactly this moment. Her fingers squeezed his with pressure that barely registered. She said, Amara. Darius understood the question beneath the question. Where is she? Is she safe? Did you bring her to watch me die? He said, Mrs. Washington has her. They're getting quesadillas and watching planes. She's okay, Mom. She's safe. Dorothy nodded, satisfied. Her eyes closed, opened again, the lids fighting gravity. She was quiet for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Her breathing shallow and irregular, the death rattle already beginning in her chest. Then she spoke again, her voice gaining strength from somewhere mortality shouldn't allow. Don't be afraid to live again, Dari. The childhood nickname hit him like a fist. Nobody called him Dari except his mother, except Serena, in their most private moments, except people who'd loved him before the world taught him that love was insufficient armor against systems designed to break you. He tried to interrupt. Mom. Her grip tightened, surprising strength in fingers that looked like they could snap. You've been hiding for 8 years. Surviving isn't living. Amara needs you whole, not just breathing. The morphine gave her clarity, that strange chemical grace that sometimes visited the dying in their final hours of burning away everything except essential truth. She looked at him with eyes that had watched him grow from infant to man, eyes that had seen him graduate nursing school and marry Serena and hold baby Amara, and break into pieces when his wife died and the medical bills came and the eviction notices started arriving. She said, find something, find someone, let yourself be seen. Darius felt tears on his face without remembering when they'd started. His voice came out wrecked, 8 years of accumulated exhaustion in 5 words. I don't know how. Dorothy's smile returned softer now, maternal. Yes, you do. You just forgot. Promise me, Dari. Promise me you'll remember. Some promises are made to be kept, and some are made because dying mothers deserve the comfort of believing their children will be okay after they're gone. Darius didn't know which kind this was, but he knew that his mother had 11 minutes at most, maybe less, and those minutes belonged to her. He said, I promise, Mom. She sighed, the sound carrying relief and release in equal measure. Her eyes drifted closed. Her breathing slowed, the intervals between inhale and exhale, stretching until he couldn't tell if she was breathing at all or if he was just hoping hard enough to imagine it. Then she spoke one more time, her voice so quiet he had to lean close to hear it. Tell Amara I love her bigger than the sky. Her hand went slack in his. The monitors didn't scream. Hospice didn't believe in aggressive intervention. The morphine drip kept clicking, indifferent to the transition between life and not life. The afternoon sun kept filtering through the blinds, creating bars of light across the linoleum floor. Dorothy Cole died at 12:58 p.m. Mountain Time with her son holding her hand, which was more than many people got and less than anyone deserved. Darius sat with her for 20 minutes, his hand still wrapped around hers, her skin cooling by degrees. A nurse entered, eventually checked for pulse, noted the time, asked if he needed anything, offered platitudes about peaceful passing and being in a better place. He said, I need to make arrangements. The funeral home director was professionally sympathetic, his handshake firm, but not crushing, his voice modulated to convey concern without intimacy. Darius chose cremation because burial plots cost thousands, chose a service for 6 days from now because bodies required time for preparation, and he needed time to gather whatever family remained scattered across a country that made staying close expensive. He paid for everything with a credit card that was already maxed and would require minimum payments he couldn't afford, but would somehow make because the alternative was his mother spending eternity in whatever holding facility stored unclaimed bodies until the state disposed of them. The return flight to Chicago wasn't until tomorrow morning, cheapest ticket, no flexibility. Darius spent $80 on a motel room that smelled like cigarettes and commercial air freshener, the kind of place that rented by the hour and didn't ask questions. He lay on the bed without sleeping, staring at the ceiling where water stains created abstract patterns, and tried to process the fact that both his parents were now dead and he was alone except for an 8-year-old daughter who needed him to be strong when he felt like dissolving into nothing. His phone buzzed at 3 a.m., pulling him from something that wasn't quite sleep. 7% battery, dying faster now. Text message from an unknown Chicago number. Mr. Cole, this is the Ashford Foundation Medical Center. We received information about your background as a nurse. Our healthcare reentry scholarship program may be of interest. Please call at your earliest convenience. Darius stared at the screen until it dimmed. He hadn't applied to any program. Someone had made a mistake, some administrative error crossing wires. Or it was a scam, predatory vocational schools that promised credentials and delivered debt. But something in his mother's voice, don't be afraid, find something, let yourself be seen, made him screenshot the message before his phone died completely. Not a decision, just preservation of possibility. He flew back to Chicago the next morning, picked up Amara from Mrs. Washington's apartment, where she'd spent the night building towers from cat figurines and eating cereal for dinner, because Mrs. Washington believed rules were suggestions when grandmothers died. Amara's eyes were red, but she didn't cry, her grief held in check by 8-year-old confusion about death's permanence. She asked, "Is Grandma with Mommy now?" Darius knelt in Mrs. Washington's doorway, eye level with his daughter, and searched for answer that was true without being traumatic. If heaven is real, then yes, they're together. Amara considered this, then, "That's good, Mommy was probably lonely." The logic of children finding comfort in imagined reunions. Darius pulled her close, breathing in her strawberry shampoo smell, and wondered if his mother was right, if he'd been surviving instead of living, if 8 years of hiding had turned into permanent residence, if there was still time to remember how to be whole instead of broken. They returned to the apartment in Humboldt Park, where eviction notices waited, and oatmeal containers held 2 servings instead of 3, and the photograph of Serena smiled from the windowsill. Darius had 4 days until the funeral, 4 days until the sheriff arrived with paperwork, 4 days to figure out what came next. He pulled out his phone, now charged, and looked at the screenshot of the message about scholarship programs and healthcare reentry and possibilities he'd stopped believing existed. His mother's voice echoed, "Let yourself be seen. Not today, maybe not tomorrow." But the message sat in his phone like a seed waiting for soil, and somewhere 2,000 miles away, a woman whose life he'd saved was beginning to ask questions about the invisible man who'd disappeared before anyone could say thank you. 2,000 miles east, in an office on the 44th floor of Willis Tower, Vivian Ashford woke in a private suite at Northwestern Memorial Hospital to the realization that she died and someone had bothered to bring her back. The IV in her arm delivered saline and antihistamines. The monitors tracked rhythms that had stopped 37,000 feet above Kansas before a stranger's hands remembered what medical school had taught them. The attending physician was explaining something about anaphylaxis and epinephrine and how lucky she was, but Vivian wasn't listening to the medicine. She was trapped in a single question that circled her consciousness like a bird looking for somewhere to land. Who saves a life and asks for nothing? The flight attendant had tried to get his name. The airline had checked the manifest. Seat 37, B economy class, registered to a passenger who'd deplaned in Phoenix and disappeared into the terminal before anyone thought to stop him. No follow-up contact information, no request for compensation or recognition or even acknowledgement. Just a ghost who'd pulled her back from the edge and then evaporated like he'd never existed at all. Vivian discharged herself against medical advice after 18 hours of observation, signing forms that released the hospital from liability if she died from delayed complications. Her assistant had brought clothes, a Valentino pantsuit, Italian leather shoes, the armor Vivian wore to remind herself and everyone else that she'd built an empire from maxed-out credit hours and a pathological refusal to fail. The woman in the mirror looked pale but functional, which was sufficient. Weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford 19 days before the largest medical technology IPO in NASDAQ history. Her driver met her at the hospital entrance, with the Lexus, his expression carefully neutral, his questions limited to destination. Vivian said the office not home because home was a penthouse apartment she slept in 4 hours nightly and spent the rest of her time avoiding. The office was where she understood the rules, where competence translated directly to outcomes, where the complexity of human interaction reduced to quarterly earnings and stakeholder value, and decisions that appeared in boardroom presentations instead of awkward conversations over dinner tables she didn't have. Dr. Lillian Grayson found her in the executive conference room at 11 p.m. on Thursday, 2 days after the plane, surrounded by financial projections and SEC filings and the documentary evidence of a company worth $3.2 billion on paper and potentially $4 billion after the market had its say. Lillian was 68, silver hair pulled back in a bun that had gone gray during her 30 years as an emergency room physician before Vivian recruited her to run the Ashford Foundation Medical Center. She was the only person in the building who called Vivian by her first name without permission, and the only person whose disapproval carried weight. Lillian set a coffee cup on the conference table. Real coffee, not the swill from the break room, the good stuff Lillian kept in her office for emergencies and late nights that blurred into early mornings. "Viv, you look like death warmed over. When did you last sleep?" Vivian accepted the coffee, its heat radiating through the ceramic into her palms. "Sleep is for people who aren't 19 days from the largest medical technology IPO in NASDAQ history." Lillian pulled out a chair and sat without invitation, her movements deliberate. "Your mother worked herself into an early grave. Heart attack at 49, alone in her office at 2 in the morning. You were 22. Don't make me watch history repeat itself." The mention of her mother was tactical, precisely aimed at the place where Vivian kept memories that complicated the narrative she told herself about success and survival. Catherine Ashford, no relation, despite the shared name, pure coincidence that had caused endless confusion until Catherine died, and the confusion became Vivian's alone to carry, had built a small pharmaceutical consulting firm through sheer force of will and systemic sexism that made every contract negotiation a battle. She'd left Vivian nothing except debt and the bone-deep terror of poverty and an iron determination to never be weak, never be dependent, never be invisible, the way poor people were invisible to the systems that ground them down. Vivian set down the coffee cup, its contents untouched. "I almost died on that plane, Lillian. 53 people watched it happen, one filmed it for social media, and the only person who moved was someone nobody noticed until he was needed." Lillian's expression shifted the clinical assessment of an emergency room physician trained to read subtext. "You're thinking about him." Not a question. An observation supported by evidence, the way Vivian had spent the past 2 days distracted during board meetings, the way she'd asked her assistant to request the passenger manifest from Spirit Airlines, the way she'd stared at the list of names like it contained answers to questions she hadn't articulated yet. Vivian's fingers traced the edge of a financial projection spreadsheet, the numbers predicting growth trajectories extending 5 years into a future she'd almost not lived to see. Who does that, saves a stranger's life and asks for nothing? Lillian was quiet for a moment, her silence the kind that preceded difficult truths. Then, someone who understands what actually matters, maybe someone you should find. But Vivian was already shaking her head, the motion small, almost imperceptible. To do what? Thank him, write a check. That's what people like me do, right? We throw money at problems until they look like solutions. Lillian's gaze was steady, unflinching. Or you could try to understand why 53 people froze and one person moved. Might tell you something about the world you've built. The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Vivian had spent 2 days replaying the incident, 53 passengers frozen business class, filming first-class passengers too important to risk lawsuit by intervening without medical credentials. Only the man in 37B economy class, worn jacket shoes that suggested financial precarity, had bothered to act. The class dynamics were unavoidable, the moral arithmetic stark. Her voice came out quieter than intended. What if finding him just confirms what I already suspect? That the system I've spent 14 years building is fundamentally broken. Lillian stood, her coffee cup empty, her expression carrying the weight of 3 decades watching systems fail people. Then maybe it's time to stop building the same system. Start over. Build something that doesn't require people to be invisible until they're needed. She left Vivian alone with financial projections that suddenly looked like evidence of a life misspent, numbers that added up to billions, but somehow equaled nothing. The investigation began Friday morning with a phone call to Owen Thorne, who'd spent 23 years with the FBI's Chicago field office before retiring to private consulting work that paid $475 per hour and required considerably less paperwork. Owen had helped Vivian with background checks on executive hires and due diligence on acquisition targets, in the occasional delicate matter that required discretion and a willingness to operate in legal gray areas without crossing into black. His office was in a building on Wacker Drive that had seen better decades, the kind of place where the elevator groaned its complaints and the hallways smelled like old carpet and commercial air freshener. Owen himself was 55, white, built like a former college linebacker who'd discovered beer and desk work, his handshake firm enough to remind you he could still handle himself if the situation required it. He listened while Vivian explained Flight 2847, Phoenix-bound anaphylactic shock, a man in seat 37B who'd saved her life and vanished. She needed to know who he was, why he'd disappeared, whether it was intentional invisibility or simple urgency that had pulled him away before gratitude could find him. Owen made notes in a spiral notebook, his handwriting cramped and efficient. I can pull the passenger manifest through my contacts at TSA, but finding him is just the first step. The real question is what you do with the information once you have it. Vivian leaned forward, her hands flat on his desk. I need to understand why he left. What was so important that saving someone's life didn't warrant 30 seconds to give his name? Owen studied her face, reading motivations she hadn't fully articulated. You want to thank him, or you want to understand what it means that nobody else moved? The question hung in the air between them, precise and uncomfortable. Vivian had spent her career avoiding self-examination. Introspection was luxury when quarterly earnings demanded constant attention, but nearly dying it had created space for questions she'd spent 14 years not asking. Her voice was careful, both, neither. I don't know, I just know that if I don't find him, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if the only person who helped me was someone the system I built had completely failed. Owen nodded, accepting this. Give me time. I'll find him. But Vivian, when I do, you need to decide what you're actually trying to fix, him or yourself. The breakthrough came 12 days later, not from airline records, but from hospital admissions. Owen had cross-referenced the passenger manifest with emergency room visits and hospice records within 500 miles of Phoenix on the day of the flight, filtering for connections that might explain why someone would deplane and disappear. Dorothy Cole, 67, admitted to Riverside Hospice 3 weeks prior with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, died October 14th at 12:58 p.m., 3 hours and 47 minutes after Flight 2847 touchdown. Next of kin listed Darius James Cole's son's Chicago address. Owen delivered his report in Vivian's office on a Wednesday afternoon, placing a folder on her desk with expression that suggested the contents would complicate whatever narrative she'd been constructing. Your mystery man had 11 minutes to say goodbye to his dying mother. That's why he didn't stick around for applause. He was racing death and losing. The folder contained more than just identification. Owen had pulled employment records, financial history, educational background, the accumulated data trail that modern life scattered like breadcrumbs for anyone trained to follow them. Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Rush University, graduated 2009 with honors. 8 years at Northwestern Memorial Hospital ICU unit performance reviews that used words like exceptional, intuitive, irreplaceable. Resigned March 2017, citing personal reasons. Current employment: night custodian, Willis Tower, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. Seasonal warehouse associate, Amazon Joliet Fulfillment Center. Weekend handyman, cash basis, Craigslist postings. Vivian's building. The man who'd saved her life mopped the floors she walked across without noticing. The financial section made her hands shake. Spouse Serena Cole, deceased December 2016. Medical debt incurred $863,000. Bankruptcy filed March 2018, discharged November 2018. Eviction notice filed October 15th for apartment in Humboldt Park, rent 47 days past due. Dependent, Amara May, Cole daughter, age 8, enrolled at Shields Elementary School, qualified for free lunch program. Vivian read the pages twice, her mind assembling story from data points. Wife died during childbirth from complications that generated nearly $1 million in debt. Husband, ICU nurse, would have understood exactly what was happening, quit 4 months later. Spent 8 years working multiple minimum wage jobs while raising daughter alone. Mother died of cancer. Funeral 6 days after death would have required travel he couldn't afford. The man who'd saved her $3 billion life was being evicted because he couldn't pay $1,500 in rent. Owen was watching her face clinical assessment of someone trained to read micro-expressions. The timing's brutal. He flew to Phoenix on a ticket that probably cost 3 months of skipped meals, saved your life in the middle of racing to his mother's deathbed, then disappeared because he had exactly 11 minutes to say goodbye. Most people would have at least given their name. Vivian's throat was tight. He didn't want anything from me. Owen's pause was deliberate, weighted with implications. Or he didn't believe he'd get anything worth the time it would take to ask. That's what poverty teaches people, that systems aren't designed to help them, that asking powerful people for anything is waste of breath. Safer to save the life and disappear than to perform gratitude for strangers who'll forget you before their luggage reaches the carousel. The observation landed like a fist. Vivian thought about the passenger manifest, the 863 names, the ones in first class who'd frozen, the ones in business who'd filmed. She thought about her company, her board, her investors, the entire ecosystem of wealth that existed because people like Darius Cole mopped floors and loaded boxes and fixed toilets for wages that wouldn't cover basic rent. She made a decision, though calling it a decision gave it more deliberation than it deserved. It was more like surrender to something inevitable. The Ashford Foundation runs a healthcare reentry scholarship program for nurses who left the field. I want him to know about it. Owen's expression suggested he understood exactly what she was proposing and all the ethical complications embedded within it. You want me to send him information. Make it look organic, not like you investigated him without consent. Vivian nodded, then stopped. Her hand went to her forehead, pressing against the headache that had been building since she'd opened the folder. No, wait, that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Using information gained through surveillance to offer help that looks voluntary but is actually control. That's what powerful people do. We investigate, we intervene, we call it charity, when it's really just another form of ownership. Owen leaned back in his chair, surprise evident. In 23 years of FBI work and 5 years of private consulting, he'd seen wealthy people rationalize worse things, but he'd rarely seen one catch themselves in the act. His voice was careful. So what do you want to do? Vivian closed the folder, her decision crystallizing. Send the information, but frame it as general outreach, not targeted recruitment. Include his name on a list with others who fit the profile: former nurses, Chicago area lapsed licenses still active. Let him think he was identified through normal channels, not surveillance. Owen nodded. And if he doesn't respond? Vivian's jaw set the expression that had served her through 14 years of building companies and negotiating with venture capitalists and refusing to accept that obstacles were anything except problems requiring creative solutions. Then I'll find another way. But I won't let him get evicted while I sit in an office worth more than he'll earn in a lifetime because I happen to eat shrimp on an airplane. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. I want you to send that information today, and I want you to monitor whether he responds. If he doesn't reach out within 48 hours, I need his work schedule. All of it. Willis Tower, Amazon, whatever handyman jobs he's taking, I'll find him myself. Owen's eyebrows rose. Vivian, that's stalking, invasive, and abuse of power. Her laugh was hollow. Yes, all of those things, but letting him lose his home while I do nothing is worse. At least this way I'm honest about what I'm doing. Owen gathered his papers, sliding them back into the folder. For what it's worth, I think you're asking the right questions. Most people in your position wouldn't. After he left, Vivian sat alone with the folder and the financial projections and the accumulated evidence of a life that suddenly looked like elaborate machinery designed to extract value from people while pretending nobility of purpose. Her mother's voice echoed, "The system doesn't care about fairness, Viv. It cares about who has power and who doesn't. Your job is to get power and keep it." Catherine Ashford had gotten power, had kept it until her heart gave out at 49, alone in an office at 2 a.m. surrounded by contracts and quarterly projections and the evidence of success that looked from certain angles remarkably like failure. Vivian pulled up her email, typed a message to Dr. Vaughn. Lillian Grayson, we need to talk about expanding the Foundation's reentry program, specifically about removing barriers to entry for candidates with financial hardship. Schedule meeting ASAP. Then she opened the folder again and looked at the photograph Owen had included: Darius Cole's employee ID from Willis Tower. His face tired but dignified, his expression suggesting someone who'd learned to be invisible, a survival strategy. She studied his eyes, dark brown, direct, holding the camera's gaze without apparent effort, and wondered what it cost to maintain that dignity while mopping floors in a building owned by people who wouldn't recognize him if they passed him in the hallway. 3 a.m. That's when the text message had been sent to Darius's phone, timed to arrive during the Phoenix motel night when his mother's body cooled in hospice and his future collapsed into uncertain space. Owen's message had been carefully crafted, professional and personal, suggesting bureaucratic coincidence rather than targeted intervention. But Darius hadn't responded. The message had been read, delivery confirmation showed that, but no callback, no email, no acknowledgement. Owen reported this 2 days later. Either he thinks it's a scam or he's too exhausted to engage. Classic poverty response when you're in survival mode. Anything that looks too good to be true usually is. Which was how Vivian found herself staying late at the office on Thursday night, 18 days after the plane, waiting for the night custodial shift to begin. She dismissed her assistant at 9 p.m., declined the security escort to her car, and positioned herself in her office where she could watch the executive floor through the glass walls that made everything visible and nothing private. At 11:07 p.m., the service entrance opened, and a man in navy blue maintenance coveralls pushed a cart loaded with cleaning supplies onto the floor. She watched him move through the space with methodical efficiency, emptying trash cans, vacuuming carpets, wiping down surfaces with attention to detail that came from understanding. Invisible work became visible only when it wasn't done properly. He reached her end of the corridor at 11:43 p.m. She stepped into the hallway before he could move past her presence, sudden enough that he stopped, his expression shifting through calculation and recognition, and something that looked like weary resignation. His voice was quiet, controlled. Ms. Ashford. So he knew who she was. Of course, he did. Recognition was asymmetrical in capitalism's architecture. The people at the bottom saw everything because invisibility required constant vigilance. The people at the top saw nothing because seeing would require acknowledging what their comfort cost. Vivian's carefully prepared speech dissolved under his gaze. She'd planned something about gratitude and obligation and wanting to help. But standing here in the hallway with him in custodian coveralls and her in designer suit, the power differential was so stark that any words she spoke would sound like exactly what they were: a wealthy person performing benevolence for psychological comfort. She said, "You saved my life." Darius said nothing. His body language suggested he'd prefer to be anywhere else, doing anything else, having any conversation except this one. He didn't move toward her or away from her, just stood there, hand on the card handle, waiting for her to finish whatever performance she'd come to deliver so he could return to work. The silence stretched. Vivian found herself speaking truth she hadn't planned. "I wanted to thank you. To understand why you left before anyone could." His laugh interrupted her, hollow and bitter, nothing like humor. "You shouldn't be thanking me. You should be asking yourself why 53 people watched you die and only one person who couldn't afford to get fired for abandoning his seat decided to move." The words landed with precision, each one aimed at the exact place where her guilt and her complicity intersected. Vivian felt her throat tighten, her eyes stinging with tears she hadn't cried in 20 years, not since her mother's funeral, when she'd stood alone in a cemetery and promised herself she'd never be weak again. She tried again. "I looked into your background. I know that's invasive. I know I had no right, but I needed to understand us." His face changed, something shuddering closed. "You investigated me." Not a question, an accusation supported by evidence. She'd done exactly what powerful people always did when encountering someone whose existence complicated their worldview. She'd used money and connections to excavate his life without permission, to turn his poverty into data points she could analyze and respond to with interventions that served her needs as much as his. Vivian forced herself to hold his gaze. "Yes, I'm sorry. It was wrong, but I found out about your wife, about your daughter, about your mother. I'm so sorry for your loss." Darius stepped closer, his voice dropping, but gaining intensity, each word carefully selected for maximum impact. "You want to understand, I was flying to Phoenix to watch my mother die. Had exactly 11 minutes to say goodbye if everything went perfectly. Spent 3 months of lunch money on that Spirit Airlines ticket, 3 months of eating protein bars in Amazon break rooms while my stomach ate itself. And you want to know why I didn't stick around for a medal and a photo op?" The corridor suddenly felt smaller, the distance between them collapsing under the weight of everything he wasn't saying. Vivian saw herself through his eyes, a billionaire who'd nearly died from eating shrimp that cost more than his weekly grocery budget, who'd hired private investigators to track down a man whose poverty she'd been complicit in creating through a healthcare system that extracted wealth from the dying and their families. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "The Ashford Foundation runs a healthcare reentry program for nurses who left the field. Full tuition housing assistance, childcare support, living stipend. 3 years of service in underserved communities after graduation. It's not charity, it's work. Every penny earned through commitment and competence. Darius's expression didn't change. You're offering me charity. The word hung between them like accusation. Vivian wanted to argue not charity, justice, restitution, an attempt to balance scales that capitalism had tipped so far in her direction that a man with 8 years of exemplary emergency medicine experience was mopping her floors while she built empires. But those words would sound like excuse-making, like the kind of thing wealthy people told themselves to sleep better in penthouses, while service workers commuted 2 hours each way to clean their offices. So instead, she said, I'm offering you a choice. Your nursing license is still active. You saved my life with training you haven't used professionally in 8 years. That means you're still a nurse even if the system forced you to become invisible to survive. This is a chance to be seen again. She pulled a business card from her jacket pocket, not her executive card with the CEO title, but a different card she'd had printed that afternoon. Dr. Lillian Grayson, Director, Ashford Foundation Medical Center, with a phone number and an address in Humboldt Park, where the foundation ran its scholarship program. She held it out. Darius didn't take it. Vivian set it on his cleaning cart on top of industrial paper towels and walked back toward her office. She made it 3 steps before his voice stopped her. Why? She turned. He was standing exactly where she'd left him, the business card untouched, his expression, asking the question underneath. The question, why would a billionaire care about one custodian when saying thank you was sufficient and considerably cheaper? Vivian searched for answer that was true, not comfortable, not performative. Because I almost died, and in that moment I understood that everything I'd built, the company, the IPO, the billions in projected value, meant nothing if the only person who helped me was someone my system had destroyed. Because I need to believe that what I do actually matters, and if it doesn't, then I've wasted 14 years building machinery that grinds people down while pretending to help them. The honesty surprised her, the admission of doubt she'd never voiced to anyone, not even Lillian. Darius studied her face like he was reading an X-ray, looking for fractures beneath the surface, assessing whether her words matched whatever he saw in her eyes. Then he picked up the business card, glanced at it, and slid it into his coverall pocket without comment. He resumed pushing his cart down the corridor, returning to the methodical efficiency of someone whose shift had 7 more floors to clean before morning. Vivian stood alone in the hallway until the elevator carried him away, then returned to her office and the financial projections that no longer seemed like adequate measures of whether her life had meant anything at all. 6 days later, Vivian flew to Phoenix for Dorothy Cole's funeral. Word count 4493. Transition to funeral scene. Emotional depth increased. Vivian's internal conflict deepened. Chemistry building through tension rather than attraction. Ready for funeral confrontation. Owen had provided the details. Pine Valley Cemetery, 2 p.m. service 11, confirmed attendees based on RSVP to funeral home. Vivian arrived 20 minutes early, rented a sedan at the airport, and drove through Phoenix afternoon heat that turned everything shimmering and uncertain. She told no one she was coming. Not her assistant, not the board, not even Lillian. This wasn't business. This was something else, something she didn't have vocabulary for yet. The service was held in a viewing room decorated with artificial flowers and uncomfortable chairs, an institutional beige that funeral homes apparently believed conveyed sympathy. Vivian stayed in the back row, counting attendees, Darius in the front, with Amara beside him, the child wearing a black dress that looked new, her hand gripping her father's with the intensity of someone afraid he might disappear too. 3 elderly women who might have been Dorothy's friends from the trailer park. A couple in their 40s who whispered to each other throughout the service. 2 teenagers who checked their phones every few minutes. A priest who read generic platitudes about Dorothy's kindness and faith, despite probably never having met her. The entire service lasted 37 minutes. No eulogy, no shared memories. Dorothy Cole was reduced to administrative closure with the efficiency of a system that processed death like any other transaction, and Vivian sat in the back row feeling like an intruder at someone else's grief, a tourist in poverty she'd never experienced and never would. She waited in the parking lot beside her rental car, watching Darius load Amara into his rental vehicle. The child clutched a stuffed bear, missing one eye. Darius stood beside the driver's door for a long moment, his shoulders curved under weight that looked like it might crush him, his face pointed toward the Arizona sky like he was searching for something that wasn't there. Vivian approached slowly, her heels loud on asphalt, giving him time to hear her, coming to prepare whatever reaction he'd decided was appropriate for the woman who'd invaded his privacy and offered charity disguised as opportunity. He turned. His expression cycled through surprise and exhaustion, and something that might have been resignation. She stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to talk, far enough to avoid crowding his grief. She said, "I wanted to pay my respects." The words sounded hollow even to her ears. She hadn't known Dorothy Cole. Her presence here was invasive, another example of privilege, turning human connection into transaction, of wealthy people showing up uninvited because they'd decided someone else's tragedy required their attention. But Darius didn't seem angry, just exhausted. His suit was old, the fabric shiny at the elbows and knees from wear the fit, suggesting he'd lost weight since the last time he'd needed formal clothing. He looked like a man operating on fumes and obligation, his grief held in check through sheer discipline, because falling apart wasn't an option when you had an 8-year-old daughter watching to see if the world was stable or if everything could collapse without warning. His voice was quiet. 11 people. That's what 70 years comes down to. 11 people who showed up because they felt obligated or had nothing better to do. Vivian had no response that wouldn't sound like platitude. So she just stood there bearing witness to his grief, offering her presence as the only thing she could give that wasn't transactional. After long silence, Darius pulled out the business card she'd given him, the one that had been living in his coverall pocket for 6 days, while he decided whether pride mattered more than survival, whether accepting help from someone who'd investigated him without consent was better or worse than watching his daughter lose the only stable home she'd ever known. His voice was careful. "This scholarship program, it's real." She nodded. 8 months intensive nursing recertification, housing in Humboldt Park 3 blocks from your daughter's school, childcare covered through our partner program, living stipend $1,800 monthly, in exchange for successful program completion and 3 years working in underserved communities after graduation. Every penny earned through work and commitment, not charity. You fail, you're out. You quit, you repay those housing costs. It's a contract, not a gift. He studied the card like it might be counterfeit, like accepting it would trigger some trap he couldn't see yet. "Then your brother, Roland. 2 weeks ago, he made it very clear what he thinks of people like me working in your building." Vivian's blood went cold. Roland did what? Darius recounted the incident with clinical precision, the time, the location, the exact words. Roland had used the coded language about situations requiring thorough cleaning and certain elements, making executives uncomfortable. The way Roland's colleagues had laughed because challenging the boss's brother was career suicide. The humiliation delivered with smile and professional tone that made it impossible to report without seeming oversensitive or paranoid. Vivian felt rage building behind her, carefully maintained composure. White-hot fury at her brother, her brilliant, charming, ambitious younger brother who wanted her CEO chair and had apparently decided that weaponizing racism was acceptable collateral damage in his quest for power. She forced herself to breathe, to think past the immediate anger. If you take the scholarship, you'd be at the foundation, not Willis Tower. Different building, different oversight structure. And Roland has no authority over foundation operations. That's Lillian's jurisdiction, and she answers directly to me, not to the corporate board where Roland has influence. Darius's jaw tightened. But he'd know, and he'd find ways to make it difficult, to undermine, to suggest my acceptance was inappropriate evidence of your judgment being compromised. The acknowledgement hung between them. The truth neither of them wanted to speak. Accepting the scholarship meant entering a space where Vivian's brother had power, where racist humiliation could become daily occurrence, where the price of education might be dignity, and the constant knowledge that some people believed he didn't belong. Vivian pulled out her phone, typed her personal cell number, and showed him the screen. "This is my direct line. If Roland or anyone else gives you trouble, any kind of trouble, harassment, coded language, anything that makes you feel unsafe or unwelcome, you call me immediately. I'll handle it. That's not a request. That's a condition of the scholarship. You experience discrimination, you report it, and I deal with it." "Understood." Darius looked at the number, then at her face, calculating whether promises from billionaires meant anything, whether this was genuine protection or just another performance of caring that would evaporate when inconvenient. Then he nodded once, sharp and final, the gesture of someone accepting terms he didn't love, but could live with because the alternative, eviction, homelessness, watching Amara lose stability, was worse. He extended his hand. Vivian took it. His palm was rough, calloused from years of manual labor, scarred from industrial chemicals and warehouse equipment, and the accumulated damage of work that destroyed bodies for minimum wage. Her hand was soft, manicured weekly at a salon that charged more per visit than he earned in a day, protected by gloves and privilege and systems designed to ensure people like her never had to experience the physical cost of surviving. The handshake was brief, professional, and electric in ways neither would admit, not attraction exactly, but recognition. Two people from different worlds acknowledging they'd somehow become connected through circumstance and crisis, and the uncomfortable question of whether helping someone was possible without controlling them. He climbed into the rental car, Amar away from the back seat through the window, gap-toothed smile visible despite the circumstances. Then they drove away, leaving Vivian alone in the parking lot, wondering if she'd just tried to save someone or if she'd simply found a more sophisticated way to exercise power while calling it kindness. The application arrived at the Ashford Foundation Medical Center 3 days later, Thursday afternoon, delivered via email to Dr. Lillian Grayson's inbox. Lillian called Vivian personally, her voice carrying carefully neutral professionalism. Darius Cole's application is complete. Transcripts are excellent, clinical references from Northwestern Memorial are glowing, and his interview is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Unless there are objections, I'm inclined to accept him into the program. Vivian sat in her office 15 days now from IPO, her company approaching $4 billion in projected value, and tried to articulate why this mattered so much when she had 1,000 other priorities demanding attention. No objections, full scholarship package, whatever he needs to succeed. Lillian was quiet for beat, the silence loaded with unspoken questions. Then, Viv, you understand that if Roland finds out you're personally invested in this candidate's acceptance, he'll use it against you. He's already making noise about the foundation's budget allocation, suggesting resources could be better spent on corporate initiatives rather than community programs. She knew. She knew and was proceeding anyway because some things mattered more than her brother's political maneuvering, because watching Darius get evicted while she sat on billions felt like moral failure she couldn't rationalize away. Let him try. The foundation's funding is protected by the original charter. He can make noise, but he can't actually cut the budget without board approval, and the board knows those programs are essential for our public image. Lillian's voice sharpened. This isn't about public image for you anymore, is it? Vivian closed her eyes, leaning back in her chair, exhaustion finally catching up. No, it's not. I don't know what it is, but it's not that. After she hung up, Vivian pulled out the folder Owen had compiled, opened it to the photograph of Darius in his Willis Tower custodian uniform, and studied his face. She was looking for something what she couldn't articulate. Evidence that this wasn't just guilt, proof that helping one person mattered when systems stayed broken, confirmation that nearly dying had changed something fundamental rather than just triggering temporary crisis of conscience that would fade once the IPO completed and her life returned to comfortable routine. She didn't know, but Monday morning, 1 week after Dorothy Cole's funeral, 3 weeks after saving a stranger's life at 35,000 feet, Darius Cole would pick up his daughter from their eviction notice apartment and drive to a new address in Humboldt Park, where sunlight came through windows and possibilities existed that hadn't yesterday. And Vivian would stare at financial projections for an IPO that would make her richer than most countries, and wonder if this helping one man climb out of poverty her system had created was atonement or just sophisticated performance of caring without actually changing anything structural. She didn't know. But for now, it was something, and something was more than the nothing she'd been doing for 42 years. The Ashford Foundation Medical Center occupied a converted elementary school in Humboldt Park, its brick exterior still bearing the architectural optimism of 1920s Chicago public works projects. Inside the transformation was complete classrooms retrofitted with medical simulation equipment, the old gymnasium divided into clinical practice stations, the library converted to study space where nursing textbooks replaced juvenile fiction. Lillian Grayson's office was on the second floor overlooking a courtyard where someone had planted a garden that somehow survived Chicago's bipolar weather through sheer stubborn refusal to die. Orientation began on a Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, first week of November, with 17 students ranging in age from 26 to 44. Darius was the oldest by 6 years and the only black man in a cohort that skewed white and female demographics that weren't surprising given nursing's history as women's work and healthcare's structural racism that made retention of black nurses statistically unlikely. He took a seat in the back row, old habit from years of trying to be invisible, and watched the others filter in with their new backpacks and anxious energy in the assumption that competence would be rewarded if they worked hard enough. Dr. Lillian stood at the front wearing scrubs and a white coat, her silver hair pulled back in practical bun that suggested she'd been wearing it exactly this way for 3 decades. Her voice carried authority that came from saving lives, not from title. She began without preamble. This program is 8 months intensive, Pharmacology, Advanced Cardiac Life Support, Trauma Protocols, Clinical Rotations at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Our pass rate is 68%. That means nearly 1 in 3 of you will fail despite our support. We're not here to babysit. We're here to rebuild your careers if you're willing to do the work. The woman next to Darius, Jenna Walsh, 26, white. Her paperwork said she'd left nursing after 2 years of pediatric oncology, leaned over and whispered, "You're the guy from Willis Tower, right?" The custodian. Her tone wasn't cruel exactly, just curious in the way people got curious about zoo animals, wondering how the creature ended up behind glass. Darius had prepared for this, the recognition that would follow him from minimum wage work into professional training, the way poverty left marks that became your identity in spaces where everyone else got to be defined by their potential. He kept his voice neutral. "Former custodian, current student, same as you." Jenna's smile was performative, tight around the edges. She turned her attention back to Dr. Lillian, who was distributing syllabi thick as phone books in textbooks whose price tags still attached totaled over $1,000. The foundation had paid for everything, which meant Darius didn't have to choose between pharmacology and groceries, but the weight of obligation was accumulating with each provided resource. Every dollar spent on his education was a dollar he'd have to repay through service, through gratitude, through the invisible currency of knowing someone had invested in him and therefore owned a piece of whatever he became. The first month was diagnostic placement exams to assess retained knowledge, skills, assessments in the simulation lab, where plastic mannequins bled fake blood and simulated dying without the stakes of actual mortality, mandatory counseling to address whatever trauma had driven them from nursing in the first place. Darius scored 94th percentile on written exams. 8 years hadn't erased what medical school had drilled into his brain, but struggled in simulations where his hands remembered the movements, but his nervous system rebelled against the memory of what those movements had failed to prevent. 2 weeks into the program, Amara woke screaming at 2 a.m., her voice tearing through the Humboldt Park apartment with the raw panic of nightmares that couldn't be reasoned with. Darius found her tangled in sheets, her face wet with tears, Mr. Patch's clutch so tight his remaining eye was pressed flat against her chest. He pulled her into his lap, her small body shaking. "I'm here, baby. You're safe. I'm right here." Her voice came out, broken between sobs. "You were gone and I couldn't find you, and Mrs. Washington said you weren't coming back, and Grandma was there, but she was all gray and the nightmare logic of children processing loss, abandonment, and death, and the terrible knowledge that people disappeared and sometimes didn't return." Darius had been so focused on his own trauma, the simulations, the panic attacks, the weight of returning to medicine, that he'd missed what moving in new schools and his constant absence for studying had cost her. He held her until the shaking stopped, until her breathing evened out, until she fell back asleep in his arms. Then he carried her to bed and sat in the kitchen with his pharmacology textbook unopened in front of him, staring at pages that refused to resolve into comprehensible information because his mind was stuck on the question, what if saving himself meant breaking her? He mentioned it to Dr. Lillian during their next check-in, the mandatory counseling sessions that tracked not just clinical competence but psychological fitness. Lillian listened without interrupting, her expression clinical, but not cold. When he finished, she said, "Children are resilient, but resilience requires support. Have you talked to her about what's changing?" He hadn't. He'd been operating on survival mode, assuming Amara would adjust because children adjusted, because the alternative was admitting he couldn't do this, couldn't be both father and student and future nurse without something breaking. Lillian's voice was gentle. "The foundation has family counseling available for both of you, not because you're failing, because transition is hard and you don't have to do it alone." That night, Darius sat with Amara at their kitchen table, real table, now not salvaged from a curb, solid and functional, and tried to find words that would explain change without promising permanence he couldn't guarantee. He started with, "You know how I'm going to school now? Learning to be a nurse again." She nodded, her gap-toothed expression solemn. "Like you were before, when Mommy was here." The connection surprised him. She'd been born into his grief, had never known him as anything except custodian and warehouse worker and father who worked constantly but never seemed to have money. "Yeah, like that, but it's hard, and sometimes I'm studying when I should be with you." Amara's voice was small. "Are you going to leave?" The question landed like a fist. "No, never. I'm right here, Amara girl. Even when I'm studying, even when I'm tired, I'm not leaving." Her eyes were wet. "Grandma left. Mommy left." Darius pulled her close, his throat tight. They didn't want to leave. They didn't have a choice. But I'm healthy and I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me. She hiccuped, almost laughed. Forever. He kissed the top of her head. Longer than that. Lillian found him alone in the simulation lab one evening during the second month, standing motionless in front of a mannequin configured to simulate postpartum hemorrhage scenario. The plastic body lay on the exam table, monitors beeping their artificial distress, fake blood, pooling beneath rubber legs, and Darius was frozen 3 feet away, like he'd been turned to stone. Lillian's voice was gentle, clinically so. Mr. Cole, your written scores are excellent, but your clinical performance suggests you're fighting more than skill decay. Darius didn't turn around. The mannequin's chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, life simulated through engineering. His voice came out flat. Every hemorrhage case becomes her. Every monitor alarm I hear that delivery room. The confession surprised him, honesty spilling out before he could contain it. He'd spent 8 years not talking about Serena's death, except in abstract clinical language that reduced trauma to medical terminology. Speaking it plainly felt like admitting weakness, like confirming he was broken in ways that training couldn't repair. Lillian moved to stand beside him, her presence solid without being intrusive. Serena Cole, December 16th, 2016. You were there. Not a question. She'd read his file, had seen the documentation, knew exactly why he'd left Northwestern Memorial. The knowledge should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt like relief, like he didn't have to explain the weight because someone else had measured it. His throat was tight. I knew what was happening. Stood there in my scrubs, 7 years ICU experience, and couldn't do anything because I wasn't her doctor. Had to watch while insurance spent 51 minutes calculating if her life was worth the cost. Lillian was quiet, her silence making space for grief instead of rushing to fill it with platitudes. Then the system failed her, not you, but you left anyway. Darius finally turned to face her. How do you keep doing it? Knowing the system's broken, training people to work in a structure that kills for profit. Her expression was complicated layers of exhaustion and determination, and something that looked like stubborn hope. Because broken systems don't fix themselves. They're fixed by people who refuse to walk away, who stay and fight and change things incrementally until incrementalism becomes transformation. You left because you were grieving. That's human. But grief doesn't have to be permanent residence. The words landed with weight, not judgment, but challenge. Darius had spent 8 years treating survival like achievement when survival was just baseline. Actually living required risk, required vulnerability, required opening yourself to possibility, that caring about outcomes meant accepting possibility of failure. He looked back at the mannequin. What if I freeze in a real situation? Lillian's voice was firm. Then you practice until muscle memory overrides the trauma. You learn to trust your training more than your fear. That's what these 8 months are for. 3 days later, Vivian received an email from Dr. Lillian marked confidential with a subject line that read simply, Month 2 update. She opened it between board meetings, standing in the Willis Tower executive washroom, where privacy was guaranteed and the marble counters cost more than most people's monthly rent. The email was brief, clinical. Darius Cole continues to excel in theoretical coursework, 94th percentile, but struggles with trauma responses during clinical simulations. Mandatory counseling in place. Family counseling added for daughter experiencing adjustment difficulties. Student remains committed. Progressing as expected, given circumstances. Vivian read it twice, her mind parsing the subtext beneath Lillian's careful phrasing. Progressing as expected, given circumstances, meant he was fighting through it. Trauma responses meant the system that had killed his wife still had hooks in him. Family counseling added meant his daughter was suffering too collateral damage from choices he'd made at Vivian's urging. She typed a response. Thank you for update. Please ensure he has whatever support necessary. Budget is not a constraint. Then she deleted it. Typed again, is there anything specific needed? Deleted that too. What could she offer that wouldn't be interference masquerading as concern money? She'd already provided that. Time, she was 19 days from IPO and sleeping 4 hours nightly. Presence, her showing up would only highlight the power differential, the way her interest in his success was complicated by guilt and gratitude, and something else she didn't have vocabulary for yet. She settled on, keep me informed. Thank you for your care with this. Sent it. Stared at her phone for 5 minutes, waiting for response that didn't come. Returned to the board meeting where Roland was presenting Q4 projections and pretending he didn't know she'd discovered his racist harassment of night custodial staff. The performance was impressive. Her brother had always been good at pretending, at smiling while calculating exactly how to extract maximum advantage from any situation. The third month brought clinical rotations at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the building where Darius had worked for 7 years and where Serena had died, and where returning felt like walking into a burning house to rescue something already lost. The ICU was on the sixth floor, accessible via elevator that moved too slowly, giving him too much time to remember his last shift 4 months after Serena died. His hands shaking so badly he couldn't start an IV. His supervisor gently suggesting maybe he needed more time. He'd never come back. Had resigned via email 2 weeks later, unable to face the physical space where every room held ghosts. But now he was here again, wearing scrubs with creases still sharp from the package, a Northwestern Memorial badge clipped to his chest reading, "Student," in red letters that marked him as supervised, not autonomous. His supervisor for the rotation was Dr. Sarah Kim, 44, who'd worked ICU long enough to recognize trauma when it walked through the door, wearing determination. She met him at the nurse's station. "Darius Cole, I remember you. You trained me during my clinical rotation 9 years ago." The recognition was disorienting evidence he'd existed in this space before grief made him invisible. He searched his memory, a medical student, competent but nervous, asking questions that suggested actual engagement. His voice came out uncertain. "I don't remember much from that time." Sarah's expression was understanding, without pity. "You taught me central line placement. Probably saved me from washing out. I owe you." Debts in healthcare accumulated in strange ways, competence paid forward through generations, knowledge transferred from experienced hands to novice ones, invisible infrastructure that kept hospitals functioning despite administrative dysfunction. Sarah gestured toward the ICU floor. "Let's see what you remember." The first patient was straightforward, 67-year-old white man, post-cardiac arrest, intubated and sedated, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the ventilator. Darius reviewed the chart, medications, vitals, lab results, and felt his hands steady. This wasn't Serena. This was a clinical problem requiring clinical solutions. Sarah watched him work through the assessment. When he finished, she nodded approval. "Good. You haven't forgotten as much as you feared." But the second patient made him falter. 32-year-old black woman, postpartum, day 3, readmitted for retained placental fragments and secondary hemorrhage. Currently stable but flagged high risk. Darius read the chart and felt the room tilt, his breath catching like he'd inhaled water. The details were different, but his nervous system didn't care about details. It recognized the pattern, and suddenly he was back in the delivery room, watching Serena's blood pressure drop. Sarah noticed immediately. She touched his elbow, gentle pressure, grounding him. Her voice was quiet. "Bathroom, now, I'll cover." Darius made it to the staff bathroom before the panic attack hit fully, his breath coming in gasps, his vision narrowing. He gripped the sink and forced himself through the breathing technique Dr. Lillian had taught: 4 counts, in, hold, 7, 8 counts out. The rhythm his body recognized as safety. 5 minutes until his nervous system accepted he wasn't in danger, that Serena had died 8 years ago, and panic wouldn't change that. When he emerged, Sarah was waiting. She didn't ask if he was okay. The answer was obvious. Instead, PTSD isn't disqualifying, but unmanaged PTSD is dangerous. Mandatory counseling non-negotiable. Darius nodded, unable to articulate the shame of breaking down on his first rotation. But Sarah continued, "I had panic attacks for 2 years after losing a patient to sepsis. 28-year-old deteriorated faster than we could intervene. Took therapy and medication to function again." The admission was unexpected vulnerability from someone who seemed entirely competent. But everyone in healthcare carried trauma, and the ones who survived learned to manage it instead of pretending it didn't exist. That evening, Vivian's phone buzzed while she was reviewing SEC filings for the IPO, now 12 days away. Text from Lillian. "Darius had panic attack during clinical rotation today. Handling appropriately, but thought you should know. He's okay." Vivian stared at the message for 30 seconds, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What was appropriate response? Concerned distance. Pretending she hadn't been monitoring his progress through weekly emails she'd asked Lillian to send confidentially. She typed, "Thank you for telling me. Is there anything he needs?" Lillian's response came immediately. Time, therapy, permission to be human, already providing all 3. Vivian set down her phone and returned to SEC filings that suddenly seemed like abstract exercises in quantifying value that had nothing to do with actual worth. She wondered if Darius knew she was tracking his progress, if he'd feel supported or surveilled, if there was meaningful difference between the two when power imbalances were this stark. She wondered if he thought about her at all. The fourth month brought first major exam comprehensive pharmacology assessment covering drug classifications, mechanisms, contraindications, dosing calculations. Darius studied until 3 a.m. nightly, his kitchen table covered in flashcards and cold coffee. Amara had learned to tiptoe past him during these sessions, had stopped asking for help with homework because Daddy was studying, had developed the quiet competence of children who understood their needs came second. He noticed, hated it, couldn't change it without failing out of the program and losing everything they'd gained. The material wasn't difficult. He'd learned it in nursing school, but recertification required proving current knowledge, demonstrating retention, despite 8 years away. He scored 97%, highest in the cohort. Dr. Lillian announced scores by percentile ranking, not names, but Jenna Walsh turned to look at him with expression combining surprise and resentment. The calculation of someone who'd assumed the former custodian would struggle and was now confronting evidence that poverty didn't correlate with intelligence. After class, she approached with performative friendliness. 97th percentile, impressive. The subtext was clear: you must have had help, you must have cheated. Somehow there must be explanation beyond competence because competence didn't align with her assumptions. Darius had encountered this before: the skepticism that greeted Black excellence, the demand for explanation when achievement disrupted comfortable narratives. He kept his voice level. I studied the material, same as everyone. Jenna's smile was tight. Right, of course, but David Park, 31, Korean-American recovering from DUI that cost him his license, interrupted before the exchange could escalate. I remember watching you during my rotation at Northwestern. You made running codes look effortless, made me want to be that competent. The intervention was deliberate, redirecting from interrogation to praise. Darius needed allies, people who'd defend his competence when others questioned it. David was becoming one. Monica Chen, 29, white, despite the surname from Chinese-American ex-husband, had also shifted from skeptical to supportive after watching him lead study groups with patience that came from actually understanding the material instead of just memorizing it. The cohort was fracturing into those who believed poverty meant incompetence and those who'd learned that assumption was both wrong and dangerous. Vivian appeared at the foundation on a Thursday afternoon in the 5th month, her first visit since Darius had started the program. Her presence sent administrative staff scrambling, everyone suddenly appearing busy and competent. She wore her CEO uniform, tailored suit, minimal jewelry expression, communicating authority without arrogance, and moved through the building conducting what might have been inspection or might have been something else. Dr. Lillian intercepted her in the hallway outside the simulation lab, where Darius was practicing IV placement on plastic arms that never complained. Their conversation was too quiet to hear, but Darius watched through the glass wall as Vivian's eyes found him, recognition instant, despite the context shift from custodian to student. Her expression didn't change. She'd been trained not to reveal reaction, but something in her posture shifted. He watched her explain something to the other student, demonstrating technique with hands that moved economically efficiently without wasted motion. The same precision she'd used saving Vivian's life. The same control he maintained when everything inside him was chaos. She found herself noticing details. She had no business noticing the way his voice dropped half an octave when explaining complex concepts, making them accessible without condescension. The way he repositioned the other student's grip with patience that suggested he understood learning wasn't linear. The way his shoulders finally relaxed when the student got it right, like someone else's success mattered to him. She forced herself to turn away before someone noticed she'd been standing there for 3 minutes and continued to Lillian's office, where power dynamics were clearer and watching Darius didn't feel like surveillance disguised as interest. 20 minutes later, Vivian entered the simulation lab alone. The other students had dispersed for lunch, leaving Darius with plastic arms and collection of IV supplies. She approached slowly, giving him time to prepare whatever reaction he'd decided was appropriate. Her voice was quieter than he expected. Dr. Grayson says you're excelling, 97th percentile on pharmacology. The compliment felt loaded with implications he couldn't parse. Was she surprised, relieved, confirming her investment hadn't been wasted? Multiple interpretations made response difficult. He settled for, I've been studying. Vivian's lips twitched, almost smile, but not quite. She also mentioned you're managing the clinical rotations better. The mandatory counseling is helping. The fact that she knew that private information had traveled from his supervisor to program director to foundation funder should have triggered anger about privacy. Instead, he just felt tired. Poverty meant privacy was luxury. People with power over your life got to know your weaknesses because refusing meant losing access to resources needed for survival. His voice came out flat. It's helping. Vivian did nodded, accepting this. Then I wanted to apologize for investigating you without permission, for using resources to excavate your life. It was invasive, and I'm sorry. The apology surprised him, its specificity suggesting actual reflection. Wealthy people rarely apologize for using power. They'd been trained to see power as natural, but Vivian seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Darius set down the IV catheter. Why did you come today? She was quiet, her expression shifting through calculations. Then because I needed to see if this was working, if the scholarship was actually helping or just making me feel better about profiting from systems that create poverty. The honesty was disarming. He'd expected corporate platitudes about giving back and making a difference. Instead, she was admitting charity might be self-serving. He heard himself speak truth he hadn't planned. It's working. Amara has her own bedroom. I'm not working 3 days. I'm learning to be a nurse again. Whether that makes you feel better doesn't change that it's working for us. Vivian's shoulders dropped slightly, tension releasing. Good, that's good. They stood in awkward silence, the space between them loaded with everything they weren't saying. Gratitude and obligation, power and dependency. After she left, Darius caught himself replaying her apology. Not the words, but the way her voice had wavered on, I'm sorry, like admitting fault cost or something. He'd spent 8 years reading people for survival, learning to detect performance versus truth. Vivian's discomfort had been real. He wasn't sure what to do with that information, so he picked up the IV catheter and returned to work. Then Vivian's phone buzzed, executive summons crisis requiring attention. She turned to leave. At the door, she paused. Roland's asking questions about the scholarship program. About you specifically. I'm handling it, but I wanted you to know. The warning was clear. Her brother was aware of Darius's presence, was suspicious or resentful, was potentially planning something. The threat wasn't immediate, but it was real. Darius's jaw tightened. What kind of questions? Vivian's expression darkened. The kind that suggest he sees your acceptance as inappropriate. As evidence, my judgment is compromised. He's positioning for a move against me, and you're part of his ammunition. The politics were beyond Darius's control. Billionaire siblings playing chess on a board where he was a pawn, but pawns could still be sacrificed. He heard himself say, "What do you need from me?" Vivian's expression was unreadable. Just graduate. Prove the program works. That's the best defense, demonstrable success. She left before he could respond. Darius stood alone, surrounded by plastic bodies, and wondered if he'd been given instruction or warning, support or burden. 2 days later, Vivian was in a board meeting when her phone buzzed with text from Lillian. FYI, Roland scheduled surprise inspection of Foundation next week. Wants to review scholarship recipient files personally. Legal says we have to comply. Heads up. Vivian excused herself from the meeting, walked to the nearest private space, a supply closet that smelled like printer toner and corporate denial, and allowed herself 60 seconds of pure rage. Her brother wasn't subtle. This wasn't about oversight or fiduciary responsibility or any of the bullshit justifications he'd wrapped it in. This was about finding ammunition to use against her, about undermining the Foundation's autonomy, about making sure she understood he could reach anywhere she built sanctuary. She composed herself, returned to the board meeting, smiled at Roland across the conference table while calculating exactly how much rope to give him before he hung himself with it. That evening, she called Darius. His number pulled up immediately from her contacts, though she'd never used it before. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice carrying background noise of Amara singing something about butterflies. He said, Ms. Ashford, always formal, always creating distance, even as circumstances collapsed it. Roland's planning an inspection of the Foundation next week. He'll have access to scholarship files, including yours. I wanted you to know before it happens. Silence on the line. Then what's he looking for? Vivian chose honesty. Evidence that my personal involvement in your acceptance represents conflict of interest. Proof that I'm using Foundation resources inappropriately. Ammunition to undermine my authority with the board. More silence. She could hear Amara's singing in the background, innocent and oblivious to the adult warfare being conducted around her. Then Darius, is there evidence? The question was fair. Was there? She'd investigated him without consent, had expedited his acceptance, had asked Lillian for weekly updates, had his direct number in her phone despite having never called it until now. If Roland looked carefully enough, he'd find pattern of special treatment that was difficult to justify through official channels. Her voice came out careful. There's context he can misrepresent, but nothing actually improper. Your acceptance was merit-based. Your performance proves that. Darius's laugh was hollow. Context and impropriety look the same from certain angles. And I'm the custodian who somehow ended up with full scholarship after saving the CEO's life. That's a story that writes itself. He was right. The optics were damning even if the substance was defensible. And Roland was excellent at optics, at constructing narratives that served his purposes regardless of truth. Vivian heard herself say, "I won't let him use you as weapon against me. If he tries, I'll—" "You'll what?" Darius interrupted. "You're already using me as shield against your own guilt about how the system works. At least be honest about what this is." The words landed like slap, precise and stinging. Vivian felt her throat tighten, her carefully maintained composure cracking. He was right. She'd told herself this was about justice, about restitution, about balancing scales. But maybe it was simpler and more selfish, about feeling less complicit, about sleeping better, about constructing narrative where she was helper instead of profiteer. Her voice came out barely above whisper. "You're right. I'm sorry." Another silence. Then Darius, softer, "I'm not saying don't help. I'm saying be clear about who benefits. Because right now we both do. And that's fine, but pretending it's pure charity helps nobody." The honesty was brutal and clarifying. Vivian leaned against the wall of her penthouse apartment, 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, view that cost more than most people earned annually, and accepted that maybe the most radical thing she could do was stop performing benevolence and just be honest about mutual need. She said, "Okay, thank you for that." After they hung up, Vivian stood at her window, looking down at Chicago sprawled beneath her like conquest, and wondered when she'd started caring more about one man's opinion than entire boardrooms full of investors whose approval she'd spent 14 years cultivating. The 6th month brought advanced cardiac life support certification, high-stakes assessment requiring both theoretical knowledge and practical skills under simulated emergency. The scenario patient and ventricular fibrillation team of 4 working together to diagnose shock, administer medications, and either resuscitate successfully or call time of death. Darius's team included Jenna Walsh, David Park, and Monica Chen. The simulation began with alarm bells, the mannequin's monitors showing irregular rhythm progressing to cardiac arrest. Darius took charge immediately, his voice calm but commanding. V-fib on monitor, starting compressions. David charged defibrillator to 200 joules. Jenna prepare epinephrine. Monica manage airway. His hands moved with muscle memory, 30 compressions at rhythm, practiced until instinct, the mannequin's plastic chest compressing under his palms. David called clear. Everyone stepped back, shock delivered, monitor showing chaos, then returned to rhythm. They ran the code for 6 minutes, compressions, shocks, medications, the choreographed dance where timing mattered more than individual heroics. The mannequin's monitor finally showed normal sinus rhythm. Successful resuscitation. Dr. Lillian entered from the control room. "Well done, Mr. Cole. Strong leadership, clear communication and appropriate delegation. Ms. Walsh, medication prep was timely, but you hesitated on dose calculation review pharmacology." Jenna's face flushed. She'd struggled with epinephrine dosing, needed David to verify before administering. The hesitation wasn't dangerous in simulation, but could be fatal in real codes. After Lillian left, Jenna turned to Darius with expression combining grudging respect and irritation. "Where did you learn to run a code like that?" The question had edge implication. His competence was suspicious. Darius was exhausted by constant need to justify excellence. His voice was flat. Northwestern Memorial ICU 7 years. Ran approximately 300 codes. The 7th month brought Amara's crisis school calling mid-lecture, asking him to come immediately. There'd been an incident. Darius left class, Dr. Lillian waving him out without question, and drove to Shields Elementary with fear eating through his chest. The principal's office smelled like institutional cleaner and bad decisions. Amara sat in a chair too large, her eyes red but her expression defiant. Next to her, Emma Harrington, the white girl assigned as science fair partner, and Emma's mother, Mrs. Harrington, whose previous complaint about that neighborhood had nearly destroyed the partnership. Principal Davidson gestured for Darius to sit. "Mr. Cole, there was an incident during science class." Mrs. Harrington expressed concern about Emma's partnership with Amara. Darius felt rage building behind careful control. "What kind of concern?" Mrs. Harrington interjected. I simply suggested Emma be partnered with someone from a more stable environment. Given that you were recently homeless and living in charity housing, the words detonated. This woman had researched his private struggles and was weaponizing them against his 8-year-old daughter. He forced his voice level, surgical. My housing is none of your concern. Amara's academic performance is excellent. The partnership continues unless you provide valid educational reason beyond your prejudice. Mrs. Harrington's face flushed. I never mentioned this isn't about race. Darius leaned forward. You didn't have to mention it. Stable environment is code. That neighborhood is code. You're using language designed to avoid saying what you mean. You don't want your white daughter partnering with my black daughter. Principal Davidson tried interrupting, but Darius wasn't finished. My daughter has maintained straight A's while living through circumstances that would break most adults. She's competent, kind, and deserves this partnership based on merit, not your comfort level. The silence was thick. Emma looked at her mother with an expression suggesting 8-year-olds understood racism even when adults pretended they didn't. Principal Davidson cleared her throat. The partnership remains intact. Mrs. Harrington, your volunteer schedule needs adjustment. This meeting is concluded. Mrs. Harrington left dignity wounded but power limited by institutional unwillingness to explicitly endorse racism while tolerating it quietly. Darius pulled Amara into his arms. Her voice was muffled against his shirt. I didn't do anything wrong, Daddy. His throat closed around words that wanted to be rage and grief and apology. But she needed strength, not his brokenness. He whispered, I know, baby, and I'm proud of you. That evening, Vivian's phone buzzed while she was reviewing acquisition proposals. Text from Lillian. Darius had incident at daughter's school today. Racist parent tried to break up science fair partnership. He handled it perfectly, but wanted you aware since Roland's looking for anything to weaponize. Vivian stared at the message, her mind assembling implications. Roland would hear about this. Someone always talked, always leaked, always fed information to whoever paid attention. He'd spin it as evidence of instability, of Darius being liability, instead of asset of Vivian's judgment being compromised by personal involvement. She typed back, is Amara okay? Lillian's response shaken, but her father handled it well. She's lucky to have him. Vivian set down her phone and pulled up Darius's number. Hesitated. What could she say that wouldn't sound like surveillance or pity or the performance of caring that he'd already called her out for? She texted instead. Lillian told me what happened at school. I'm sorry Amara experienced that. She's fortunate to have you defending her. If you need anything, call. His response came 20 minutes later. We're okay, thank you. 3 words. Professional. Creating distance. But he'd responded, which meant something. Vivian sat alone in her penthouse and wondered when protecting one family had become more important than quarterly earnings, when one man's opinion had started mattering more than board approval, when she'd stopped calculating return on investment and started just caring. In the car, Amara was quiet, staring out the window. Then, Daddy, why are some people mean to us? The question Black parents had been answering for generations, the question that never got easier because 8-year-olds needed explanations that wouldn't steal their childhood. Darius chose carefully. Some people are afraid of things they don't understand, and scared people sometimes act mean. But that's their problem, not yours. Amara considered this. Are you scared? Of what? Poverty returning, the failing the program, Roland destroying Vivian's scholarship, his panic attacks preventing graduation, the 1,000 ways this could collapse? Yes, terrified. But he said, not of being who we are, never that. Amara seemed satisfied, but Darius sat at a red light, watching his daughter in the rearview mirror, and realized somewhere in the past 7 months between accepting scholarship and scoring 97th percentile and defending his daughter from racism and learning to accept help from someone whose power could crush him, he'd started living again instead of just surviving. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, until he looked back and saw the distance traveled. And 8 years after Serena's death, for the first time since watching her hand go limp in his Darius Cole, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his mother had been right. Surviving wasn't living, and it wasn't too late to remember the difference.